Hello students, welcome to the first session of chapter number 21, that is neural control and coordination. So in this chapter we will be studying about the nervous system, how it coordinates the whole body with the help of brain. What is coordination? What is controlling and coordination? When it comes to coordination, it involves different types of muscles, it involves different types of organs, different related, unrelated organs coming together and functioning as one. For example, while physical activity or physical exercise is done, when exercise is done, it requires muscles, it requires skeletal system, it requires energy, automatically oxygen is required in higher amount. When oxygen is required in higher amount, then the lungs will start to breathe in more and the filtration or separation of gases takes place within the lungs, and this oxygen what is present in the lungs should be now transferred into the blood, which is done by the circulatory system, and then each and every cell will be supplied with enough amount of oxygen and which helps them in producing higher metabolic rate to generate energy. That is how the coordination takes place. Now when it comes to lower organisms about their nervous system, in human beings we have neuron cells which helps in control and coordination, or which helps in formation of the human nervous system. Whereas in invertebrates or smaller organisms, these do not have a complex nervous system. Instead, they have brain and nerve cells. These nerve cells are termed ganglia. They have a network of nervous system including the ganglia. So that is how they coordinate their body function in case of invertebrates. In vertebrates we have neuron cells, and in invertebrates they have brain, nervous tissues along with ganglia. Next we will have to study about the human nervous system, or how it coordinates and controls. When it comes to the control and coordination, human body nervous system is divided into two different types, that is central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system and peripheral nervous system are the two divisions which come under human nervous system. Central nervous system, it includes the brain and spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system, it includes all the nerves which come under the central nervous system, or which are generated from the central nervous system. This peripheral nervous system are further classified into two different types. So when it comes to peripheral nervous system, they are classified further into autonomic nervous system and somatic nervous system. When it comes to autonomic nervous system means here the signals from the central nervous system is transferred into the involuntary muscles or organs. It is transferred into involuntary muscles or organs. So it includes the smooth muscles. Autonomic nervous system helps in transferring the signals from the central nervous system into the involuntary muscle region. Whereas somatic, it helps in transferring the signal from the central nervous system into the skeletal muscles. So this are the two different types of peripheral nervous system, where autonomic nervous system transfers the signal from the central nervous system into the involuntary muscles or organs, that is especially the smooth muscles, whereas somatic nervous system transfers the signal from the central nervous system into the skeletal muscles. Next is, there are two different types of fibers which are seen in autonomic nervous system, that will be efferent and efferent nerve fibers. So, autonomic nervous system have two different types of nerve fibers, that is efferent nerve fiber and efferent nerve fiber. When it comes to efferent nerve fiber, transmit the impulse from tissue or organ into central nervous system, whereas efferent transfers the impulse from central nervous system to tissue or organs. So, that is about the different parts which comes under the human nervous system. The nervous system can be classified into two different forms, including the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system includes brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system, it includes the nerves which are arised from the spinal cord, which spreads throughout the body. Now, the peripheral nervous system is further classified into autonomic nervous system and somatic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system passes the signals from the central nervous system into the smooth muscles or involuntary organs, whereas somatic nervous system passes on the signal from the central nervous system into the skeletal muscles. This autonomic nervous system is further classified into two different forms based on the two different types of nerve fibers. So, they are of efferent nerve fibers and efferent nerve fibers. Efferent nerve fibers include the signals or the impulse being transmitted from the tissue or organ into the central nervous system, whereas efferent helps in transferring the impulse from the central nervous system into the tissues or organs. Next, we will have to study about the structure of the neuron. This is the diagrammatic representation of a neuron. So when it comes to neuron, it is classified into two different regions, that is the cell body and the axon, where the cell body includes the receiving part of the signal, that includes dendrites. The signals or the impulse received from the dendrites are now transferred into within the neuron, which contains of a nucleus surrounded by Nissls granules. From here, the signals are now transferred into the next classified part of neuron, that is what we call axon. So when the signals are now transferred into the axon has different parts. So here axon, it includes the myelinated sheath which contains the Schwann cells. This myelinated sheath is not spread throughout the axon, but they are present at regular intervals. The region where the axon can be directly seen, that is what is called node of Ranvier, where there is no myelin sheath. So the axon is covered with myelinated sheath along with Schwann cells, but they, at regular intervals there are some space which is present, which is not covered with myelinated sheath in axon, that is what is termed node of Ranvier. Now the received signals from the dendrite, which has been transferred into the cell body or the nucleus region, and the Nissls granules are now pushed into the axon region. So from the axon they reach the end part of the axon called axon terminal, which ends with the synaptic knob. From the synaptic knob, the signals, those signals will be in the form of chemicals. These chemical signals are now transferred into the muscles or the neuron dendrites. So the presence of neurons will be in such a state that if this is the dendrite which receives the signal, passes into the cell body, then into the axon, and here comes the axon terminal. Later in the lower level, either there will be a muscle or there will be a next neuron to receive the signals. That is how it takes place. That is about the neuron. Once again to explain, a neuron contains two different regions, cell body and axon region. Cell body has dendrites to receive the impulse or signal, transfer it into the inner region containing nucleus and Nissls granule, transfers it into the axon where it is insulated with the myelin sheath containing Schwann cells. At regular intervals, the space is present where there is no myelin sheath termed node of Ranvier, and the axon ends in axon terminal bearing the synaptic knob. From the synaptic knob, the chemical signals are next transferred into either the next neuron or the muscles. Next we will have to study about different types of neurons. These types of neuron are purely based on the number of dendrites and axons present in them. So here it will be three different types. One will be multipolar, second one is bipolar, and the third one will be unipolar. So when it comes to multipolar neuron, here it will be having many dendrites and one axon. You can find this on the cerebral cortex of the brain, which has many dendrites and one axon. Next one is bipolar neuron, which has one dendrite and one axon, which can be seen in the retina of eyes. It can be seen in the retina of the eyes. Next one is unipolar neuron, which is devoid of dendrites and has only axons. These do not have any dendrites but have only one axon, which can be identified in the embryonic stage, which can be seen in the embryonic stage, which is called unipolar neuron. So they are classified into three different types: multipolar with many dendrites and one axon, whereas bipolar with one axon, one dendrite, and unipolar with only one axon without any dendrites, but they do have cell body. So these multipolar neurons can be identified in the cerebral cortex of the brain, whereas bipolar can be seen in the retina of the eye, and the last one unipolar can be identified in the embryonic stage. Next, based on the presence of myelin or absence of myelin, axons are further classified into two different forms. That will be types of axons. They are mainly of two types. First one is myelinated, second one will be non-myelinated. If the axon has myelin sheath with the Schwann cells, then it is called myelinated axon. Axon allalli myelinated sheath iddu, Schwann cells iddu, ಮಧ್ಯದ ಸ್ಪೇಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ ಆಫ್ ರಾನ್ವಿಯರ್ ಇದ್ರೆ ಅಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ myelinated axon ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ. ಇಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ you can identify in the spinal cord or cranial nerves. You can identify them either in the spinal cord or in the cranial nerves. Next, when it comes to non-myelinated, here the axon is not having any myelin sheath or Schwann cells or node of Ranvier is completely absent. They are naked in together, and this type of non-myelinated can be identified in autonomic and somatic neural systems, where you can see non-myelinated axons. So these are the different types of axons. Next, we will have to study about the generation of nerve impulse that can be identified in the body. So next is about the generation and conduction of nerve impulse. In this diagram you can see that first of all, to define what is conduction. So a conduction means it is the stimuli which passes on into the nerve, creates a wave within which leads to the conduction process. So in this conduction, the major involvement will be of a neuron will be the axon part. The axon part will be a cylindrical part which is made up of an outer layer called axolemma and the inner cytoplasmic component which is called axoplasm. So when it comes to the distribution of ions, that will be sodium, potassium and chlorine. So these three ions are the one which leads to generation or conduction of this nerve impulse. So let us study the first part of the conduction which is called polarized state or the resting potential. So when it is in the resting potential, the axolemma and the axoplasm and the outer region of the neuron which is termed interstitial fluid. So if you see the axoplasm, here the sodium and potassium ions will be present which gives a positive charge. But if you compare both sodium and potassium, there is one more ion concentration which is chlorine, and this chlorine is not diffusible. They cannot diffuse from the axoplasm into the interstitial fluid. Their number retains same in the axoplasm as well as in the interstitial fluid. So here if you compare the sodium and potassium, chlorine amount will be more, because of which one the axoplasm will be negatively charged. Whereas outside the axoplasm, that is in the interstitial fluid, the amount of chlorine will be less compared to sodium and potassium, because of which one there will be positive charge, especially if you see in potassium and sodium, the amount of sodium will be much more compared to potassium. So that is why the positive charge can be observed in interstitial fluid. When the neuron is in such condition where the axoplasm will be negatively charged and the interstitial fluid will be positively charged. This is termed polarized state or resting potential. ಈ resting potential stage ಅಲ್ಲಿ axoplasm ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ಲೋರಿನ್ ಸಂಖ್ಯೆ ಸೋಡಿಯಂ ಅಥವಾ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ ಗಿಂತ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಇದ್ದು axoplasm ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನೆಗೆಟಿವ್ ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅದೇ ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಇಂಟರ್ಸ್ಟಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಫ್ಲೂಯಿಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ಲೋರಿನ್ ಗಿಂತ ಸೋಡಿಯಂ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಸೋಡಿಯಂ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ ಅಯಾನ್ ಕಾನ್ಸಂಟ್ರೇಷನ್ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಆದ್ರಿಂದ ಸೋಡಿಯಂಗೆ ಇರುವಂತಹ ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರೊಜೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ವೈ ಇಂಟರ್ಸ್ಟಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಫ್ಲೂಯಿಡ್ ವಿಲ್ ಬಿ ಪಾಸಿಟಿವ್ಲಿ ಚಾರ್ಜ್. ಸೊ ಈ ತರ ಕಂಡೀಷನ್ ಒಳಗಡೆ ನೆಗೆಟಿವ್ ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಇಂಟರ್ಸ್ಟಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಫ್ಲೂಯಿಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಪಾಸಿಟಿವ್ ಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಇತ್ತು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಇಂಥ ಕಂಡೀಷನ್ ರೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಪೊಟೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಅಥವಾ ಪೋಲರೈಸ್ಡ್ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಅಂತ ಕರಿತೀವಿ. whenever there is a stimuli passed into stimuli dendrites ಇಂದ ರಿಸೀವ್ ಆಗಿಬಿಟ್ಟು ಸೆಲ್ ಬಾಡಿಯಿಂದ ಆಕ್ಸಾನ್ ರೀಜನ್ಗೆ ಬಂದಾಗ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಈ ಪೋಲರೈಸ್ಡ್ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ದೇರ್ ವಿಲ್ ಬಿ ಅ ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್. ಏನು ವೇರಿಯೇಷನ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಇಟ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿವೇಟ್ಸ್ ದ ಸೋಡಿಯಂ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ ಪಂಪ್. ಈ ಸೋಡಿಯಂ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ ಪಂಪ್ ಹೇಗಿರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ದೇರ್ ವಿಲ್ ಬಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಚೇಂಜ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೋಡಿಯಂ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ. ಸೊ 3 ಮಾಲಿಕ್ಯೂಲ್ ಸೋಡಿಯಂಗೆ 2 ಮಾಲಿಕ್ಯೂಲ್ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಚೇಂಜ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಫ್ರಮ್ ದ ಇಂಟರ್ಸ್ಟಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಫ್ಲೂಯಿಡ್ ಇನ್ ಟು ದ ಆಕ್ಸೋಪ್ಲಾಸಮ್ ಆಸ್ ವೆಲ್ ಆಸ್ ವೈಸ್ ವರ್ಸಾ. So now when the stimuli is passed into the axon, here what happens is the polarized state of the axon becomes depolarized. Depolarized ಆಗುವಾಗ ಸೋಡಿಯಂ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ ಪಂಪ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿವೇಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಈ ಸೋಡಿಯಂ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ ಪಂಪ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿವೇಟ್ ಆದ ತಕ್ಷಣ ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಇರುವಂತಹ ಸೋಡಿಯಂ ಒಳಗಡೆಗೆ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಬರುತ್ತೆ, ಒಳಗಡೆ ಇರುವಂತಹ ಪೊಟ್ಯಾಷಿಯಂ ಆಚೆ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಫಾರ್ ಎವ್ರಿ 3 sodium exchange there will be 2 potassium being exchanged in the sodium potassium pump. And now the polarized state become depolarized state where the amount of sodium will be more in the axoplasm giving it positive charge, and in the interstitial fluid as the sodium and potassium amount has been reduced it is denoted with the negative charge because now the chlorine amount is more in the interstitial fluid. This condition is called depolarized state. And remember one thing, the depolarization doesn't spread throughout the axon continuously but it spreads part by part. Part by part idu change ಆಗ್ತಾ ಹೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ನಾವು ರೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಅಥವಾ ರೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಪೊಟೆನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಅಥವಾ polarized state in the, now the axon has come to its action potential. So in the depolarized state, it activates the sodium potassium pump, and this activation of sodium potassium pumps leads to exchange of 3 sodium with 2 potassium molecules, because of which one axoplasm becomes positively charged and the interstitial fluid becomes negatively charged. Now the sodium amount in the axoplasm is more than chlorine, and in the interstitial fluid the amount of sodium is less than the amount of chlorine, which gives the negative charge into the interstitial fluid. So here only a part has been converted from polarized state to depolarized state. Next what happens is, this depolarized state will spread the stimuli into the next part of the axon and they return back to their original position. So here the first part, which was depolarized now, will get back after passing the signal into the normal state. Again the sodium potassium pump is activated, sodium from within the axoplasm moves outside, potassium from outside comes inside. There will be many sodium potassium pumps in which there will be exchange of 3 sodium with 2 potassium. So it will become repolarized, because of which one there will be negatively charged, which is representing the amount of chlorine in the axoplasm, and in the interstitial fluid it will be having positive charge because the amount of sodium is more compared to the chlorine here. So here it has now reached the repolarized state. Now ಈ ಡಿಪೋಲರೈಸ್ ಏನಿತ್ತು ಅದು repolarize ಆಗಿದೆ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿ polarized part ಏನಿದೆ ಈ depolarized ಅಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಮುಂದೆಗೆ spread ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. So now the polarized has become again depolarized, where again there will be activation of the sodium potassium pump, which leads to exchange of sodium and potassium, giving the axoplasm a positive charge and the outer region a negative charge. Next the last part will remain in the polarized state until this signal spreads to the last part. Now when it comes to the next stage, now repolarized ಆಗಿರುವಂತದ್ದು ಹಾಗೆ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, depolarize ಆಗಿರುವಂತದ್ದು repolarize ಆಗಿರುತ್ತೆ, polarized ಇರುವಂತದ್ದು depolarize ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. So here the 2 sets or 2 forms will get converted into repolarized form, giving negative charge within and positive charge outside, and the polarized state now becomes depolarized, giving positive charge inside and negative charge outside. That is how the conduction takes place part by part. Once the stimuli passes to the whole axon, then it is next transferred into the axon terminal. This is how there is generation or conduction of nerve impulse. Once again to discuss, it involves 3 different ions, that is sodium, potassium as well as chlorine, as well as it involves 3 different stages, that is polarized state, depolarized state and repolarized state. The gradient created between these ions leads to the conduction of nerve impulse. So when it is in the resting state or when it is in the polarized state, the amount of chlorine in the axoplasm is more compared to the interstitial fluid, which gives a negative charge to the axoplasm. And in the interstitial fluid, the sodium potassium amount is more, especially the sodium is more, which gives a positive charge to the interstitial fluid. Next, when it comes to the next category, the part of this polarized state, now due to accepting the stimuli from the dendrites into the cell body, and then when it reaches the axon, gets converted into depolarized state. In this depolarized state, they get or they activate the sodium potassium pump, which leads to exchange of 3 sodium ions with 2 potassium ions. This activation leads to increased number of sodium in the axoplasm, giving it positive charge, and in the interstitial fluid now the potassium and sodium has been reduced, which expresses the amount of chlorine present there, giving it a negative charge. This signal gets transferred into the next part of the axon, converting the polarized into depolarized, where the first depolarized now returns back to its normal position, that is what we call repolarizing, which can be seen in the third diagram. repolarizes. Repolarization is similar to that of polarization, where the negative charge is more in the exoplasm and positive is more in the interstitial fluid. Next, the polarized state now has undergone depolarization, giving the positive charge within the exoplasm and negative charge in the interstitial fluid. So, this whole signal goes, or the stimuli goes part by part throughout the axon, and thus helps in conduction of nerve impulse. So, that is all in today's class. In today's session, we did learn about the different types of neural system, that is central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system components, that is brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system, we have studied about autonomic nervous system, we have studied about somatic nervous system. We also have studied about efferent nerves and efferent nerves, how the signals transfer from brain to part of the body or from the organs into the brain. We also have studied about the neuron, that is the structural and functional unit of nervous system, their parts, their functions and how they work. Apart from this one, we have studied different types of neurons based on axon and dendrites. We also have studied about types of axons, which includes myelinated and non-myelinated. Apart from this one, we also have studied about generating and conduction of nerve impulse. That is all in today's session. In next session, we will be studying about transmission of the nerve impulse. Thank you.